They didn't see you as a threat, not at first. To them, you were simple to understand, predictable, emotional, responsive, the kind of person they could read and adjust to. And that's exactly how it started. You reacted. You explained yourself. You tried to keep things clear. You tried to be understood. And every time you did, they learned something. What gets a reaction? What makes you pause? What makes you explain? And slowly, without you realizing it, a pattern formed. Because to a narcissist, this isn't random. It's observation. They're not just interacting with you. They're studying you, figuring out where your responses come from, what you tolerate, what you question, what you let go. And when someone believes they understand you that clearly, they become confident. Confident in how you'll respond. Confident in how far they can go. Confident that no matter what happens, they can predict you. And for a while, they were right. You stayed consistent. You stayed engaged. You stayed in the dynamic. But what they didn't see was what was happening underneath all of that. Because while they were studying your reactions, you were starting to notice theirs. Not all at once, not dramatically, just small moments. Things that didn't quite add up. A response that felt off. A pattern that repeated. A shift that didn't make sense. And that's where everything begins. Not with confrontation, not with distance, but with awareness. Because the moment you start paying attention is the moment the dynamic quietly starts to change. And that's the part they never account for. In the next chapter, we'll look at how you unknowingly played the role they expected, and why that made everything easier for them to control. At the beginning, nothing felt calculated. You were just being yourself. Open, honest, responsive. You explained things. You communicated clearly. You tried to keep things smooth. And on the surface, that looks healthy. But inside this dynamic, it created something else. Predictability. Because every time something happened, you responded the same way. You addressed it. You explained it. You tried to resolve it. And that consistency became something they could rely on. Because to a narcissist, a predictable person is a manageable person. Not because you're weak, but because your responses are visible. Easy to anticipate. If they say something, you'll explain. If they push, you'll react. And over time, they stop guessing. They start expecting. Expecting how you'll respond, how far they can go before you push back. And that's where the shift begins. Because once someone feels like they can predict you, they start adjusting their behavior, not to connect, but to control the outcome. And you don't see it happening in real time. Because from your perspective, you're just communicating, trying to make things make sense. But from theirs, they're learning something simple. That no matter what they do, you'll stay engaged. And that belief gives them confidence, not in you, but in their ability to manage you. And that's the part they misjudge. Because while you were playing the role they expected, you were also starting to notice, quietly, gradually. And that's what they never account for. In the next chapter, we'll look at the moment something stopped making sense, and why that feeling mattered more than you realized. It didn't happen all at once. There wasn't a moment where everything just became obvious. It was smaller than that. With a narcissist, it rarely feels obvious at first. Something didn't add up. At first, it was easy to ignore. A response that felt slightly off. A reaction that didn't match the situation. A moment where what they said and what they did didn't quite align. And you noticed it, but you didn't stay on it. You explained it away. Maybe they misunderstood. Maybe it came out wrong. Maybe you're overthinking it, so you moved past it. But then it happened again. Different situation. Same feeling. Something about it just didn't sit right. And this time, you paused a little longer. Not enough to confront it, but enough to register it. Because now it wasn't just a moment. It was a pattern starting to form. Small inconsistencies, repeated reactions, subtle shifts in behavior. And none of it was obvious enough on its own. But together, it started to create a feeling. A quiet sense that something wasn't right. And that's where most people get pulled back in. Because instead of trusting that feeling, they try to resolve it. You try to communicate more clearly. You try to understand it better. You try to make it make sense. But the more you try to make sense of it, the more it slips. Because the issue isn't clarity, it's inconsistency. And inconsistency is hard to confront when you're still giving someone the benefit of the doubt, but something in you is starting to shift. You're paying attention now, and that's the part they don't notice. Because while they still think the dynamic is the same, you're no longer fully inside it. You're watching it. And once you start watching the pattern, it becomes harder to ignore. In the next chapter, we'll look at what happens when observation turns into awareness, and you start seeing the pattern in real time. At some point, you stopped just feeling that something was off and started watching it. Not emotionally, not reactively, just paying attention. With a narcissist, this is where everything begins to shift. Because now you're not just in the interaction, you're observing it. You notice the timing of their responses, when they deflect, when they redirect, when they avoid something completely. You start catching patterns, not just what they say, but when they say it, how they say it, what happens right before and right after. And once you start seeing it that way, it's hard to unsee, because the same behaviors keep repeating. Different situations, same structure. You bring something up, it shifts. You try to clarify, it redirects. You stay on it. It escalates or disappears. And instead of reacting the way you used to, you pause. Not because you're unsure, but because you're noticing. You're starting to understand the sequence. And that awareness changes your position. Because now, you're not just responding in the moment. You're recognizing the pattern behind the moment. And that's something they don't expect. Because from their perspective, nothing has changed. You're still there, still engaged, still in the dynamic. But underneath that, you're no longer participating the same way. You're analyzing it, quietly, without announcing it, without confronting it. And that's what makes this stage so important. Because awareness doesn't show itself immediately. There's no visible shift yet, no confrontation, just observation. But that observation is building something, clarity. And once clarity starts forming, reaction starts fading. Because when you can see the pattern clearly, you don't get pulled into it the same way. In the next chapter, we'll look at what happens when that awareness starts changing your responses and why their usual tactics begin to miss. At first, they didn't notice the change, because on the surface, you were still there, still in the conversation, still engaged, but something about your responses started to shift. Subtly. With a narcissist, it's not the words that change first, it's the reaction behind them. You weren't as quick to respond. You weren't as eager to explain. You didn't feel the same urgency to fix things, and that difference started to matter because the dynamic they were used to relied on your reaction, your emotion, your engagement. And now, that engagement wasn't the same. You still responded, but it was calmer, shorter, more controlled. You weren't feeding the conversation the way you used to, and that creates something unexpected. A break in the pattern, because when someone is used to a certain reaction, even a small change becomes noticeable. They say something, you don't react the same. They push, you don't rise to it. They shift the conversation, you don't follow. And at first, it doesn't register fully. It just feels different. But different is enough to disrupt the flow, because now the outcome isn't predictable anymore. And that's where the miscalculation begins, because they're still using the same approach, the same tone, the same tactics, expecting the same result. But the result isn't there, and they don't understand why yet. Because from their perspective, nothing has changed. But from yours, everything has. You're no longer responding from emotion. You're responding from awareness. And awareness doesn't react the same way. It pauses. It observes. It chooses. And that's the moment the dynamic starts to slip. Not dramatically, not visibly, but structurally. Because once your reactions change, their control starts to weaken. In the next chapter, we'll look at what happens when your responses become harder to read, and why unpredictability changes everything. At some point, it stopped being about what you said and started being about what they couldn't figure out, because your responses weren't the same anymore. Not just calmer, different. With a narcissist, unpredictability is where control starts to break. Because before, they could read you. They knew when you'd react, when you'd explain, when you'd try to fix things. But now, that pattern isn't there. They say something, you pause, they push, You don't respond the way they expect. And that creates something they're not used to. Uncertainty. Because now, they can't anticipate the outcome. They can't guide the interaction the way they used to. So they start watching more closely your tone, your timing, your words, trying to find something familiar, something they can use to predict you again. But it's not there, because you're no longer reacting from the same place. You're responding intentionally, and intention doesn't follow pressure. It doesn't move on demand, and that's what makes you different now. Not louder, not aggressive, just harder to read. And that's where the misjudgment begins, because they thought they understood you. They thought they had you figured out. But what they didn't account for was change. And now they're working with outdated assumptions, trying to use the same approach on someone who no longer responds the same way. And that's where mistakes start happening. In the next chapter, we'll look at the moment they make the wrong move, and why pushing too far exposes everything. The moment they misjudged you was the moment they became too confident, because up until now, their tactics had always worked. The pressure, the guilt, the shifting, the emotional reactions. At some point, those patterns became automatic to them, predictable, reliable, and that confidence made them careless. With a narcissist, overconfidence is usually what exposes the pattern, because when someone believes they fully understand you, they stop being cautious. They assume the old reactions are still there. They assume the same pressure will still work. So they push further, harder tone, sharper words, more obvious manipulation. And this time, something unexpected happens. It doesn't land. Not the way it used to. You don't rise to it. You don't defend yourself. You don't scramble to fix the tension. You just see it clearly. And the moment you see a tactic while it's happening, it loses a lot of its power. Because now, the interaction feels different to you. Slower, more transparent, almost predictable. You can see where it's going before it gets there. And that's the mistake they made. They thought they were dealing with the same version of you. The emotional version, the reactive version, the version that stayed inside the confusion. But that version is fading. And for the first time, they're interacting with someone who understands the structure behind the behavior, not just the words, the mechanism. And once someone starts seeing the mechanism clearly, the dynamic begins to change very quickly, because awareness removes surprise. And without surprise, manipulation becomes much harder to maintain. In the next chapter, we'll look at the moment everything fully clicks, when you stop reacting emotionally altogether, and they realize too late what that means. You saw through it instantly. At some point, the delay disappeared. You no longer needed hours to process what happened. You saw it instantly. The tactic, the shift, the pressure behind the words, and that changes everything. Because with a narcissist, confusion is part of the mechanism. The longer it takes you to understand what's happening, the more control they have inside the interaction. But now, the reaction is gone before it even starts. They say something manipulative, and instead of absorbing it emotionally, you recognize it immediately. You see where it's going. You see what it's trying to trigger, and because of that, it doesn't land the same way anymore. That's the moment the dynamic flips. Not when you become louder, not when you attack back, but when you become clear, controlled, unaffected. And this is the part they never prepared for, because they spent all their time studying your emotions without realizing you were studying the pattern. They kept telling you to stop being emotional. They didn't realize what would happen if you did, because now they're dealing with someone who doesn't react automatically anymore. Someone who pauses, observes, understands. And that awareness makes their tactics feel obvious, not powerful, not confusing, just predictable. And for the first time, they start realizing something is wrong, because the things that used to control the interaction aren't working anymore. And once that realization starts setting in, the illusion begins collapsing very quickly. In the next chapter, we'll look at the moment they realize it's too late, that the version of you they thought they understood is gone. At first, they thought it was temporary, a phase, a mood, something that would eventually pass, because in their mind, the dynamic had always recovered before. You always re-engaged, always reacted eventually, but this time felt different. And they could feel it, because now, when they look at you, they don't see the same person they thought they understood. The emotional reactions are gone. The confusion is gone. And without those things, their usual tactics stop creating movement. That's when the realization starts setting in. Quietly, gradually, the version of you they built their confidence around doesn't exist anymore, because the person they thought they could predict is now seeing everything too clearly, and clarity changes the interaction completely. You're no longer reacting inside the pressure. You're observing it from outside of it. And that creates something they never prepared for. Psychological distance. The kind that makes manipulation stop landing the same way. And that's why this moment feels different to them. Because for the first time, they're interacting with someone who understands the game while it's being played. And once that happens, control becomes much harder to maintain. And if this content is hitting for you, if you've experienced this exact shift yourself, leave your story in the comments. Because a lot of people go through this quietly without realizing how many others have experienced the same thing. And once someone truly sees the pattern, they never interact with it the same way again. In the final chapter, we'll look at what happens after the shift is complete, when you're no longer reacting to the dynamic at all. After dealing with a narcissist for long enough, something in you changed permanently. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, but completely. Because once you fully see the pattern, you can't go back to interacting with it the same way. You stop over-explaining. You stop chasing clarity from people committed to confusion. You stop reacting to pressure the way you used to. And most importantly, you stop underestimating yourself. Because this entire time, they thought awareness would never happen. They thought the confusion would last forever. They thought you would always stay emotionally inside the dynamic. But what they failed to understand was that the same person they underestimated was learning the entire structure while living inside of it. Because now, when manipulation appears, you recognize it. When pressure appears, you recognize it. When guilt, blame, or emotional tactics appear, you recognize them almost instantly. The game loses most of its power. That's the real shift. Not revenge, not conflict, clarity. And that's why they misjudged you. They thought they were dealing with someone emotional. They didn't realize they were dealing with someone capable of understanding them completely. And if this series connected with you, stay with us here on The Silent Regime. Because this channel isn't about bitterness. It's about clarity, sovereignty, peace through understanding. We expose the patterns, the tactics, and the structures behind manipulation, so you can recognize them early and stop getting pulled into them. Because once you truly understand the dynamic, you stop fearing it. And once you stop fearing it, control starts disappearing with it.